the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we just want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. You'll get access to our wonderful Discord server and some additional content. We have done there's been a couple of reading groups. I think we're trying to work through scheduling issues with those since Taylor got a new job. So just bear with us on that front. But there is previous content available on the Patreon account. If you're interested, definitely consider that. But today we're diving back into A Thousand Plateaus and specifically 1874, 3 novellas, or What Happened, which going into this, it's funny, going into this, I was like, oh, this is going to be a slog, or this is going to be one that I'm just not engaged with. But I actually found a lot of really interesting things, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say to some of the things that I'm going to bring to bear here. I want to set the question that I posed to you rhetorically and for the listener, and that is, which lines do you draw and at what cost? Which sounds ominous.
Yeah, I think I was just on that section when you had texted me that. Don't they say for yourself and for others? Isn't that how the sentence ends? Which lines do you draw and at what cost for yourself and for others? I think that's how it goes.
I'll double check the PDF unless you have it up.
This one says, this is page 203 down towards the bottom, where they say the body is the only practical object of schizoanalysis. And by the body, they mean the body without organs. What is your body without organs? What are your lines? What map are you in the process of making or rearranging? What abstract line will you draw and at what price for yourself and for others? I thought that's what you might be referencing, but they maybe.
Yeah, no, I think that was okay.
It. Gotcha. Yeah. Well, before you regale me with
I'm going to regale you, all right.
Yeah.
Prepare yourself to be regaled.
Before you tell me a little bit of the things that you found intriguing, because I think that might be a fun way of discussing the 3 novellas plateau. What I wanted to say was, I was telling you beforehand, I feel like this is the transitional plateau. And later on in our discussion, we'll talk about the molar line, the molecular line, and the abstract line. We'll talk about those because that will be important. They'll spend a ton of time in pretty much the whole plateau of Plateau 9. The next one is going to be discussing segmentarity. And so we get introduced these lines, which they haven't really thrown at us, except maybe they've talked about lines of flight. Maybe in the rhizome introduction, they discussed lines, trees, rhizome, but they focus in on lines in this one plateau in a way that they haven't yet. They introduce it and present some problems. And it's next plateau that will really dive. They'll take another angle and try to tell us about these different lines, the different segmentarity, the rigid, supple segmentarity. It's good if we spend time on that later on the lines, maybe to finish up so that we can jump right into that when we discuss the next plateau. So that was really all I wanted to say up front. Is that's why it felt like a transitional plateau. It's one of the shorter ones that we've read. There's going to be some really long ones towards the end. Some of the plateaus are not equal in terms of the word count. So
I was going to suggest to maybe readers, especially I think anyone that really, really wants to immerse themselves in this plateau, I think maybe the strategy would be to read the novellas first and then read the plateau and then go back and read the novellas again.
We would have done that.
You're not coloring yourself with, you're over-determining your, like, the Deleuze stuff whenever you first, unless you've already read them. Maybe that would be a different strategy. But
yeah, we should have done that for today, but we do as we say, not as we do. So
time is out of joint if that's
Yes. I do remember reading the crack up at some point. It's been a long time, but I haven't read the three novellas title. They actually do a kind of, let's call it a reading. Let's call it we could say they apply, maybe they dramatize the idea of the different lines through these three novellas, right?
Yeah,
Instead of explaining it like in the micropolitics chapter, they'll take ethnographic and anthropological data to start off by talking about rigid segmentary, blah, blah, blah. Here, the three novellas they look at is Henry James's In the Cage, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Crack Up. And if you remember when we had on Alenka Zupancic, she had brought up the Fitzgerald crack up story because Deleuze devotes one of the appendices, the fifth one, I think, in a logical sense, is also a reading of this story, if I recall. And that's why she brought it up in our discussion, which was nice and surprising that she brought some lesser known Deleuze to bear. And then the third novella is The Story of the Abyss and the Spyglass by Pierrette Fluchot. I'm not familiar with this guy, but that story was interesting in particular. I guess they were all interesting. Anyway, yeah. So read the novellas or read one of them, then go see what Deleuze and Guattari say, and then come back to them. I think that's a good strategy, Coop.
I do recall. My memory is dog shit, but I absolutely do remember Zupancic and the crack reference. I don't remember any of the like context for it like you do, but I specifically do remember both of you discussing the crack. So
it was definitely relevant to her reading of sex.
Yeah.
Specifically in that Hegelian, it was a kind of a splicing of Hegel and Deleuze, if I recall, which is always fun there. If Deleuze, in the different lines, when he talks about there's the couple, the double, and the clandestine, if Deleuze is crossing the abyss, like in that third story, and meeting his double, it's like Hegel coming back at him. It's just like his white shadow. I was
going to wait, but you have me thinking, at least for this plateau, the clandestine figure is that of Leibniz, actually.
Oh, okay. What made you think that?
I just think, well, right off the bat, the discussion of the lines and so forth, I think recalls the sort of the influence of the differential calculus, the segmentation, etc., from Leibniz and his influence on Deleuze that we've discussed. We did the fold. I don't know I can't recall how much we discussed of lines and segmentarity in that episode, but I feel like
probably we talked about so much.
Maybe Simon Duffy, or I don't know if Simon Duffy or what's Jon Roff. Can't recall if we ever got into that stuff with those guys, because we definitely discussed the calculus and Leibniz with both of them.
Well, yeah,
to some extent. So
and obviously we had Dan on for the fold discussion. And what's interesting too is that if the couple is related to the secret in all its banality and all of its commonplaceness, the matter of the secret, and the double is supposed to be associated with the form of the secret, which will come back up later, specifically in Plateau 10, where they unpack this notion of the form of the secret being the key thing, not what the secret represents or what's behind what the secret points to. And then the third one is where there's neither form nor matter of the secret. That's the abstract line, right? Now we've gotten to the clandestine. We've gotten to the becoming imperceptible, which is, I think, why that would be my reading of the clandestine, because they don't really unpack it and give us more indication. The clandestine is the figure of imperceptibility becoming imperceptible.
It never really dawned on me the Leibnizian roots of kind of micropolitics and the micro aspect, right? Because it's like there's so many, if you're going on from Leibniz, it's like the infinitesimal compose the lines themselves, right? So much of that is imperceptible to us, right? And one of the arguments that they want to make about the molar and molecular, I think, is that it's at the micro level that it's not necessarily this top down molar always.
Molar bad, micro good.
Certainly they would definitely want to bring that into question. I think that's the ethics of that, like Spinozan ethical push there. But as far as the imperceptible changes that exist that take place at the level below our ability to conceive of them or perceive them per se.
I think that's... go ahead, sorry.
I just think that kind of aspect, the sort of the aggregation of the micro sort of view that, I don't know, that's really, to me, the way that Deleuze like flips someone like Leibniz's rigid ontology on its head, so to speak, is just really fascinating. And to me makes Leibniz like just revives Leibniz as the, it kind of reminds me a little bit of last week to some extent, the way that we discussed Freud and the notion of of sublimation. Freud's sort of idea of sublimation was this conservative approach where they were trying to show, okay, well, they say the same thing, but or do something different with it. And I think that sort of similar process is how they mobilize Leibniz, who I think there's even one time where compossibility is mentioned in the text, and I don't know if you would be better suited to let us know if that's a translation issue or if that's a direct reference.
I don't think so. I recall that towards the end, for example, this is page 206. What are your couples, your doubles, your clandestines, and what are their mixes? When one person says to another, love the taste of whiskey on my lips like I love the gleam of madness in your eyes. What lines are they in the process of composing or, on the contrary, making incompossible? So, yes, I don't think that's a translation issue. I think that's this question of composing lines, but also the compossibility and incompossibility of lines. That language is directly Leibnizian, even if he's not mentioned in this plateau. So that's a good catch.
I think the petite perceptions too is another.
Yeah, the little perceptions, the tiny perceptions. I was going to say, do you remember when we had Gil Morehon on and we discussed that, the little perceptions Leibniz talking about. And Deleuze himself will unpack that, not only in the fold, but in difference of repetition, that aspect of the monads.
And how the imperceptible have a fundamental impact on the continuity of things, which kind of mirrors the way that micropolitics is similar, maybe a logic or something like that they're using.
If you remember, I think maybe it was Plateau 6. It could have been Plateau 3. They blend together. I apologize. But they give a kind of law of deterritorialization where they say the slowest deterritorialization is not necessarily the least intense. And that I think they say something about how the most deterritorialized, I have to look up their laws. I think it was Plateau 5, Plateau 6. I have to go back. We need to make a list of them. I only say this, and I'm not going to try to find the list now, is because they add another kind of, I will call it a kind of law. If this is on page 204, where they start with the 4 problems, right? The first concerns the particular character of each line. And they say, I'll just read this. So line of molar or rigid segmentarity, line of molecular supple segmentation, line of flight, many problems arise. The first concerns the particular character of each line. It might be thought that rigid segments are socially determined, predetermined, overcoded by the state. There may be a tendency to construe supple segmentarity as an interior activity, something imaginary or phantasmatic. As for the line of flight, would it not be entirely personal, the way in which an individual escapes on his or her own account, escapes quote unquote responsibilities, escapes the world, takes refuge in the desert or else in art? False impression. Supple segmentarity has nothing to do with the imaginary, and micropolitics is no less extensive or real than macropolitics. Politics on the grand scale can never administer its molar segments without also dealing with the microinjections or infiltrations that work in its favor or present an obstacle to it. Indeed, this is the law. Indeed, the larger the molar aggregates, the greater the molecularization of the agencies they put into play. I'll stop there. This is similar to the law, I'll call it a law, I'm using this loosely, to the law that they find in the postulates of linguistics plateau, where they say the more a language is standardized, the more there are minorizations going on, coefficients of minorization. So I think it's particularly important for something like the French language, which they have the French Academy trying to trying to suggest and strongly suggest French alternatives for words that have become borrowed and taken into the language from outside. I think the example I remember off the top of my head was trying to get people to stop saying bulldozer, offering a kind of long-winded turn of phrase that no one's going to use that would be proper French. We talk about the Queen's English or the King's English from Great Britain with its standards. The more a language standardized, the more there is a coefficient of let's call it deviance or deviation from the norm. And so here, the larger the molar aggregates, the greater the molecularization at play. And it makes sense, right? Now, that doesn't go into what I had said earlier. We'll get to that about how Deleuze and Guattari don't want us to think that I think they say in the ninth plateau, and I can't remember if Charles was the one or if it was Henry who offhandedly quoted it saying, don't believe a little suppleness will save us. So just because the molar line is rigid or just because it's molar doesn't necessarily mean it's bad or worse than a supple line or a line of flight. This goes into the stuff with Charles about all the warnings, about don't destratify too quickly. Go ahead. I
was just going to say that specifically brought to mind. I just love that little line about keep a little plot of land for yourself.
Yeah.
Make yourself a body without working, which I don't know. I have such an affinity for that line. It's so great. I don't know. There's just something. Well, that's so nicely for me.
That sounds like that's a great thing to bring up because now that we're talking about lines and lines of flight, wouldn't that little plot of land that would be accessory, something like an escape route? Always keep a little escape route for flight, the plot of land, like you said.
Yeah, so, it goes back to the nomadology, which is funny because of I think like some of the monadology aspects of Leibniz in this particular plateau, but that's getting a little bit off.
Well, monad and nomad are anagrams. Is that the word?
I'm not sure how that would.
Is that the word for it uses the same letters? Am I using anagram correctly? Jesus. Anagram, a word or phrase formed by rearranging. Yeah, rearranging the letters. Yeah, cool. That's an anagram. So, and I guess another anagram would be man do, but that doesn't mean much. Okay. So, yeah, I was going to I used the word wrongly, but I'll stick with it. Regale me with some of your insights. At least we can start with one, and I'm not going to put you on the spot and make you list them all, but we could start with one, and maybe that could be a way of diving.
Yeah, I have a lot on the Leibniz stuff, but I think really in terms of chronology, which I'm using a tongue-in-cheek here, that's a subtle joke for everyone, is the first thing that jumped out at me when I first started reading this plateau is the similarity between the sort of way that they discuss temporality as it pertains to the three focuses, not the novellas themselves, but as far as the tale, the novel, and the novella, and the different relationships to temporality that those have. I felt like that very clearly mapped on to Deleuze's three syntheses of time.
See, this is great. And it's funny because, not to shit on the discussion or the point you break up, but like a few pages in, they're like, actually, it's not really about time, but it's actually about the relation to secrecy or discovery. And it's, you bitch. But yes, if the novel is the living present, chronos, and its way of integrating what has happened and what will happen is into the sphere of chronos, it does so differently than the novella and the tale. The novella is about what has just happened and has this fundamental relation to secrecy, and this is page 193, and they say not with the secret matter or object to be discovered, but with the form of the secret which remains impenetrable. The tale has a relation to discovery, what's just about to happen, right? The form of discovery, independent of what can be discovered. I like that. And I will add on to this that you're right about the three syntheses of time and different repetition, but it also, I think, even more clearly, or at the very least, for me, I think I was telling you this last week when I was describing this plateau to you, it really feels at home in logic of sense as well. The three syntheses of time are going to be, if you will, asymmetrically condensed into the living present of chronos, where past and future are merely dimensions of this present.
Oh, that's good.
And ion, where the present is what's always eluded, and and the past and the future divided up indefinitely. Now, chronos and ion are obviously not opposed, but they're almost like diastole and systole, right? They're like the different beatings of a rhythm of the heart or something like that. They're not opposed, but they're two. And Deleuze and Guattari will do this often with dualism. So they'll be like, well, they're not opposed, they're mixed, or they're not opposed, it's two different ways. like macropolitics and micropolitics are not opposed. It's two different ways of looking at the same situation.
Yeah, which kind of goes to that example, my Freud example with sublimation, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty clear, concrete example, which maybe I should link that discussion to.
Yeah, I think for the emphasis for Deleuze and Guattari is on sexuality, where sublimation for Deleuze and Guattari is not a good concept of what's going on. Because I think for them, their emphasis is to kind of say that, like they say in this plateau, which is a phrase that always stuck in my mind, they say politics precedes being. This is when they're discussing schizoanalysis, and it's a practice in politics, bodies with organs, mapping, and all this. I think for them, to emphasize desexualizing libidinal investments is wrong-headed, because it would be as though it were also depoliticizing them, or at least the emphasis of them. And I think for Deleuze and Guattari, if politics diffuses everything to the same extent that sexuality does, desexualizing the libido and the libidinal investments in the way that Freud tries, not as much in that last text we read, but elsewhere tries to emphasize, would also be a way of asepticizing the unconscious and depoliticizing it. And I think that that's something that they, like in the linguistics plateau, they chastise linguists for doing. For like Saussure realizes that language is a heterogeneous reality, but believes that science can only study a kind of homogeneous totality as objectively. And for them, that's a way of asepticizing the unconscious, whitewashing it from as a pragmatic suffuser of the linguistic field.
I was also thinking, sorry, if you had...
No. But what we saw was Freud's point was kind of like, I tried to make if you remember, I tried to say that Freud seems close to Deleuze and Guattari by saying, look, if pleasure is the interrupter of the imminent process of desire. Now, Freud obviously didn't say it like that, but he reached the same conclusion as Deleuze and Guattari did in the Body Without Organs plateau when they chastised the priest for using pleasure as one of the tools for breaking up desire's imminent process. So Freud reaches a similar conclusion by saying, look, if pleasure, sexual or not, is always easily obtainable without any obstacle, there would never be great creations in culture. And so I think that Freud there feels very close in spirit,
right,
in that way of discussing sublimation. Anyway,
because of the affect, right? It's like the libidinal charge is ultimately like the intensity of the affect through art, through creation, through experimentation, etc., is where it's dovetail along. But I was going to go back to, if I'm not mistaken, doesn't Deleuze call difference in repetition? Doesn't he make a reference to detective novel there? Because that also shows up, right? Because it straddles the line between these temporalities to some extent. Because there's certainly a past there's an investigation. I don't know. I'm thinking about, is it Guy de Maupassant or whatever, the necklace? I'm thinking about.
Maupassant. Yeah.
Guy, rather.
Guy. Yes, Guy. I'm not your buddy, Guy. Deleuze, in the preface to Difference of Repetition, says that philosophy, or I think he says studies in the history of philosophy, I have to look, has to be part detective novel or detective story and part science fiction. Now, we didn't get anything about science fiction here, but they start this plateau by pointing out the detective story as the quintessential aspect of, they say the detective novel is particularly hybrid genre, right? The tale and the novella, I think, is what they're suggesting. Because it's not just investigating what just happened and investigating the form of the secret, but also investigating what's about to happen. And that's the form of discovery. So it's a nice mixture, a hybrid of those two.
Did we already discuss the way that the temporalities relative to the novel, the novella, and the tale? Just want to make sure we hit those.
Yes, I did try to.
Okay, cool. All right,
I did try to suggest that the novel is the. They say the novel. This is on the very first page of the Plateau 192. It is not very difficult to determine the essence of the novella as a literary genre. Everything is organized around the question: what happened? Whatever could have happened. The tale is the opposite of the novella because it's an altogether different question that the reader asks with bated breath. What is going to happen? Something is always going to happen, come to pass. Something always happens in the novel too, but the novel integrates elements of the novella and the tale into the variation of its perpetual living present. That's why I brought up Chronos and Ion. If the novel is this hybrid that is, and they say the word duration here in parentheses, and I assume it's italicized because it's meant to, this is the nod to Bergson. Bergsonian duration. And I don't remember, we're name dropping a lot today, old guests, old friends. We had Ben Woodard on when we discussed creative evolution. One of the things that I think his name is Donald Landis. If I'm messing up his name, I apologize. He recently retranslated creative evolution after almost a century. And he gives good reasoning for why he leaves the French word for duration, which is durée, untranslated. Because our sort of common everyday understanding of duration is, in fact, not at all what Bergson had in mind. Or at least one of the ways of thinking of duration is something that can be measured. And for Bergson, that would homogenize what is essentially a heterogeneous lived reality. This is why the perpetual living present is Deleuze's.
I mean, that's pretty interesting in respect to the micro. What is it? The Leibniz the
tiny perceptions or little perceptions.
Yeah.
Or I do think that I believe Leibniz may use the French. He may call them petite perceptual, but I would have to double check with a Leibniz scholar. But they're often translated just as little perceptions or tiny perceptions. The example that Leibniz gives and that Deleuze seizes upon is we perceive the totality of the sound of the waves crashing on the beach of the ocean, but we only perceive very small amount of it distinctly. So it's an obscure app. I may have gotten those two mixed up. This is why Deleuze will break the clear and distinct from Descartes into the obscure and confused and rearrange them. But in any case, Leibniz's point is that there are these little unconscious perceptions that we do not clearly perceive, and yet we perceive them. This is why the monad is able to experience the totality of the world from its own little window, its own little its own little perspective, but precisely from its perspective, it's only able to perceive a small amount of things, whereas it apperceives the whole. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, here's where I can get my Dune shit out of the way for everyone.
Oh, yeah, get it.
Much to everyone's chagrin. Couple of things. One thing I think in terms of the novel and temporality that is interesting about Dune in particular is the style in which Herbert writes as if this is a history. And a lot of times especially
in the later novels, right? Or at least
even from the beginning, like we're looking back, we're always looking back in time.
Okay.
At as if we're in the future, looking back at this biblical sort of narrative about this figure Muad'Dib, and it's only there is elements of the like the secret or that's maybe too on the nose, but who the fuck is Muad'Dib? Because we get these chapter epigraphs or epigrams at the beginning of each chapter that are these sayings from Muad'Dib, but it's not revealed until much later who the fuck Muad'Dib is, and Herbert plays with this reveal structure in other Children of Dune as well. There's a historian that kind of you don't find out who this historian is until the end of the book, but it's also the way that Herbert undercuts a lot of the narrative as far as plot is concerned, because that's not the emphasis. It's not necessarily what happens, because a lot of that is prefigured to some extent. Because for example, in Dune Messiah, Paul has his visions of the future, which don't necessarily fully spell out how the novel is going to end, but they certainly point to pretty clearly events that will take place. So it undercuts the dramatic tension in a sort of way, but not really. Something else that's interesting that I think is relevant is the micro and the macro, or the molecular and the molar, because in Dune Messiah, for example, you have the introduction of the Dune Tarot deck. And this is something that became really popular on Arrakis during Paul's reign. And what was happening and what was challenging for Paul as the sort of the master of the molecular temporality and vision and future and determination and what have you. So he actually, at the micro level, all of these people that are divining the future through the Dune Tarot create a sort of, it all clouds his ability the ability of his visions at the molar level, if that makes sense. So it's like the little aggregates of the micro futures that are being divined by the everyday Fremen or whomever throughout the empire they're kind of kicking up, they call it kicking up dust and obscuring corners of the future, let's say.
Interesting.
So I don't know. I thought that obviously that's certainly not something that Herbert planned, but it is just interesting to see how that relationship, I don't know, how he is aware of that similar, I think that maybe the importance of the micro too, because he also in Dune Messiah makes reference to, like Paul talks about, he considered himself, I forget, it's something like an architect of government, but things in men's, the quoted, this is a shitty paraphrase, but it's like things in men's breasts and so forth would always make it difficult. And they would like present these challenges to his like top down control and like trying to to erect this government would be met by these challenges at the micro level. The sort of libidinal economy at the micro level would cause these ancient forms he refers to it as snapping back into place. So Dune conversation over.
Well, as we know, we'll get to a plateau where they reference Dune directly. We've talked about that a few times on the show, but it'll be fun when we actually get there. So yeah, we talked about, the three syntheses of time and obviously Ion, Chronos, and all of that. I did mention that at a certain point in this discussion, they'll be like, well, it's not so much about the temporality as about the form of the secret and the form of discovery that makes the tale and the novella interesting. So not what the secret would be in its matter, what the thing would be pointed to, because as they say, it could be as banal as anything. The other thing I think that goes to this is on page 194, and they'll do this throughout the book where they'll just throw a noun out. I know in this plateau at one point they just say rhizome. And I think when they're discussing Hjelmslev, they say Norwegian omelet. This is like a little inside joke. In any case, they say the word or the phrase perceptual semiotics. And the ironic thing, so they say, let's see, take Fitzgerald. He is a tale and novella writer of genius. He is a novella writer when he asks himself whatever could have happened for things to have come to this. He is the only one who's been able to carry this question to such a point of intensity. It's not a question of memory, reflection, old age, or fatigue, whereas the tale would deal with childhood action or impulse. Yet it is true that Fitzgerald only asks himself the question of the novella writer when he is personally worn out, fatigued, sick, or even worse off. But once again, there's not necessarily a connection. It can also be a question of vigor or love. It still is, even in desperate conditions. It is better to think of it as an affair of perception. You enter a room and perceive something is already there, as just having happened, even though it has not yet been done. Or you know that what is in the process of happening is happening for the last time. It's already over with. You hear and I love you is the last one. Perceptual semiotics. God, whatever could have happened, even though everything is and remains imperceptible, and in order for everything to be and remain imperceptible forever. So it's interesting that on the one hand, perceptual semiotics, but on the other hand, we know that there too, the goal is of becoming imperceptible, which is something that I think they end the faciality chapter talking about when they bring up probe heads, where at stake is this becoming imperceptible that thwarts the gridding and sort of surveillance mechanisms of control that faces bring along with it. In any case, yeah. So I was just thinking perceptual semiotics linking to your discussion of little perceptions in Leibniz.
Do you think too that maybe the three syntheses of the unconscious have some relevance to the way that the different lines, like the intersecting of lines and so forth? Or is that too far out of
the only thing that's tough about that is we know that the three syntheses are about connection, disjunction, and conjunction, right? And the language that Deleuze and Guattari use, like when they're discussing the Henry James novella with the character the telegraphist or the telegraphist, and her rigid line of segmentarity. Her fiance is a grocer, and they say the fiance can say to the young woman, even though there are differences between our segments, we have the same tastes and we are alike. I'm a man, you're a woman, you're a telegraphist, I'm a grocer. You count words, I weigh things, our segments fit together, conjugality. So there's a question of the conjugation of rigid lines. But as we know, there's also this question of abstract lines, like you brought up earlier. What are your lines? what lines are you drawing? What are your abstract lines that you're drawing, and at what price for yourself and for others? There, the language is that of composing and of compossibility or incompossibility, which is what got us on our Leibniz excursus. Directly connecting it to the question of connection, disjunction, and conjunction, and the different syntheses. I do think it would not, I'm not saying it's ruled out, but it wouldn't be an apparent leap to bringing that in. And that's why I'm just a little bit hesitant. I'm not exactly sure the kind of modifications we would need to directly implement that discussion to what we're looking at together here.
Yeah. What about going back to the petite perceptions, maybe to tie things together? And they do talk about the glances, postures, these kind of subtle signs, maybe, and maybe tying that to Proust, just in the sense of the way that the Madeleine conjures up the stream, the whole. I don't know. So that's a very micro. It's a very micro level thing that sends them on this search.
Or I was going to say in Proust and Signs, right, where Deleuze develops this, in that Proust has these four different worlds of signs that all feed into one another, right? The worldly signs of the salons, the signs of love and jealousy, the signs of involuntary memory, right? The sensible signs of the Madeleine, and then the signs of art. All of those kind of feed into this question of perceptual semiotics, because for Deleuze, to learn is to become sensitive to the signs of a given field, if you will, in the broadest sense. So becoming sensitive to the signs of illness makes one a doctor. Becoming sensitive to the signs of wood allows one to become a carpenter. And so that right there, I think that typology of signs in the search is where I would go with this perceptual semiotics that Deleuze and Guattari are laying out.
Your example of the woodwork made me think back to Simondon a bit, which I think is kind of interesting. I hadn't really considered that.
Yeah. What's interesting, right, is that Simondon himself, as we know, and this again, this example will directly come up in A Thousand Plateaus. Again, I think I believe it's in the Novellas chapter, where Deleuze and Guattari sees upon Simondon's notion of the implicit forms. So the woodworker working with a whittling knife to make a little figurine.
Maybe a little horse figure.
A little horse figure, there you go, is able through the tool to be sensitive to the implicit forms that are already inherent in the matter. This is part of Simondon's way of extending his critique of hylomorphism, right? That matter itself already has these implicit forms that one works to and is sensitive to. Now, there are other woodworking tools that are not, that ignore those implicit forms, like the lathe, for example, right? I'm sure there's plenty of tools that both allow for the technician to be sensitive to those implicit forms and work with them, and then other tools that maybe on a more mass industrial scale that aren't considering the porosity or fibers or the grain, etc., all these different implicit qualities and forms of the wood, and is merely looking for the same regimented homogeneous result. So Deleuze and Guattari will seize upon this in the Novellas chapter to talk about following the flows of matter. And we'll get there soon. But yes, so Simondon spends a significant amount of time with this example of the wood. He's good at doing this. Like, for example, we've talked about the example of the brick and the mold, the example of the crystal. And so the example of wood and woodworking and these other things will also be something Simondon will spend more time on. I think we could go back to the problems, the four problems. So I started reading the first one when I wanted to bring out that line or that law about the larger the molar aggregate, the greater the molecularization at play, right? And that was about the particular character of each line. And this is page 204. They end that paragraph. Lines of flight are realities. They are very dangerous for societies, although they can get by without them and sometimes manage to keep them to a minimum. I believe in the next segmentarity, the micropolitics plateau, the next plateau, they'll talk about defining zones of power in a society as by what is allowed to leak from them, what is allowed to escape. The word for fleeing and for leaking is the same in French. So lines of flight are lines of fleeing instead of obviously flying like a bird. It's lines of fleeing, but also lines of leakage. It's the same. So it's interesting to think that there's a hydraulic undertone to lines of flight and they even, I think Masumi, the translator, seizes upon this. This is in that same paragraph, 204, right in the middle. Lines of flight, for their part, never consist in running away from the world, but rather in causing runoffs, as when you drill a hole in a pipe. There is no social system that does not leak from all directions, even if it makes its segments increasingly rigid in order to seal the lines of flight. Even though Masumi doesn't indicate the wordplay here, he already, in his translator introduction, he already has pointed out this fact about fuite as meaning flight, fleeing, and leaking. Deleuze and Guattari are playing with this. So that's the first problem, the particular character of each line. And so what's cool about this is that if you have the rigid segments and you have the abstract line of flight, for Deleuze and Guattari, and they'll go into this more in the next plateau, the supple lines of the supple molecular lines are in between, in the sense in which they can tip towards rigidity or towards the abstract line of flight. And there's something very similar in this way of theorizing three lines as we saw in, not just in the body without organs plateau, but in the third plateau, where the abstract machine, I think in the third plateau, this is how they describe it, the abstract machine can, and I would assume in their analysis, depending on the lines, but we might have to revisit it. It can tip towards stratification, towards the strata. One side is facing the strata, right? But another side is facing the body without organs. So this in-betweenness we've seen in 4 in their descriptions. And I'll stop there. So that's the first problem. That's the first problem. The second problem is in the next paragraph, the bottom of 204, the respective immanence of the lines. And I guess I was gesturing towards this second problem, right? It's with the supple line being able to tip towards rigidity or abstraction. And if you remember in that discussion with Charles, they do say something about, instead of wildly destratifying, take stock of the strata, gently tip the assemblage. And maybe that's what I should have said instead of abstract machine. Assemblage is one side's facing the strata, one side's facing the BWO. So they're saying, instead of wildly stratifying, gently tip the assemblage towards the body without organs in order to negotiate degrees of freedom from stratification. So the respective... Oh, sorry, I misread this. This is not... The second problem is not about immanence. I think that's the third problem. It's about the respective importance of the lines. You can begin with rigid segmentarity. It's the easiest. It's pre-given. And then you can look at how and to what extent it is cross-cut by a supple segmentarity, a kind of rhizome surrounding its roots. Then you can look at how the line of flight enters in, and alliances and battles. But it also is possible to begin with the line of flight. Perhaps this is the primary line with its absolute deterritorialization. It is clear that the line of flight does not come afterward. It is there from the beginning, even if it waits its hour and waits for the others to explode. Supple segmentarity then is only a kind of compromise operating by relative deterritorializations and permitting realizations that cause blockages and reversions to the rigid line. It is odd how supple segmentarity is caught between the two other lines, ready to tip. And that word comes back up. I wonder, the French verb, ready to tip to one side or the other, such as its ambiguity. So, and then the third problem, the mutual immanence of lines. It is not easy to sort them out. No one of them is transcendent. Each is at work within the others. Immanence everywhere. There's another. It's just no verb sentence. Lines of flight are immanent to the social field. Supple segmentarity continually dismantles the concretions of rigid segmentarity, but everything that it dismantles, it reassembles on its own level. Micro-Oedipuses, micro-formations of power, micro-fascisms. The line of flight blasts the two segmentary series apart, but it is capable of the worst, of bouncing off the wall, falling into a black hole, taking the path of greatest regression, and in its vagaries reconstructing the most rigid of segments. And that, again, was what they were saying in the body without organs plateau, right? Wildly destratifying can easily lead for stratifications to come back upon us even harder, right? So this continues some of the warnings about thinking that a little suppleness will save us, or that deterritorialization without strategy is necessarily better. Even though Anti-Oedipus and sometimes in A Thousand Plateaus, it does seem to, they do sometimes seem to give the illusion, I'll say, that deterritorialization good, reterritorialization bad. But as they try to elaborate, and they will do more of this, every deterritorialization comes with its complementary reterritorialization. So it's
I mean, the same applies to the segmentarity, because the suppleness can, like the rigid segmentarity can provide a certain stability, and then the supple segmentarity can provide more flexibility. And so it's like a mixture of the two, and there's trying to step away from the kind of binary morality aspect of one thing being, I guess, what would you say, like one form being bad in a predetermined way, or like forget the word I'm trying to say, but predetermined is probably the word. Okay, this category is bad, period. It has no positive effects and so forth. So they try to show how even that kind of binary thinking is just not going to lead you ultimately to an understanding, perhaps.
No, it just makes things easy for us, but it misleads us at the same time. So, yeah.
It's like what was Gill saying? It's like the Spinoza stuff about I forget what the actual terminology is, but where you have the thoughts.
Keep going, try it.
It's like the notions, the ideas, not the mistaken ideas, but it's something like that, right? It's like there's some type of terminology. It's not incomplete idees, but it's something along those lines.
Inadequate ideas.
Right? Exactly. That's what I was thinking.
We always start with inadequate ideas from. We always start with the locus of our body and how it allows us to orient ourselves in the world, and that's necessarily at that level we're necessarily working on inadequately, just so to speak, right? And so we have to work our way up from the first to the second level of knowledge, and then eventually to the third, which is kind of God's eye view. It's a question if it's possible for humans, but theoretically, perhaps, practically, maybe not. But forming adequate ideas is yeah. Okay, so sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just making a stupid joke about Muad'Dib could give that. Mm-hmm. But what do you think about, I think this is kind of an interesting point about the way that they discuss, they don't really talk about structure so much, and the emphasis is on lines, which I think implies like there's a dynamism to the line and the tracing even that gets lost in structure, where there's it goes back to this sort of transcendent idea, or the hylomorphism in a certain sense, right? Where there's a top down rather than the aggregate of these the petite perceptionals or whatever.
They say something.
If you follow me.
I'm trying to take a stab at it, but I'm not sure that I followed. Can you reform the question first?
Well, I don't know if it was a question per se, but it's just more to note that they don't focus on structure, and they focus more on lines with reference to the way that they talk about supple and rigid segmentarity, like rather than structure. That in itself is an interesting approach.
This is good.
It's different, right? It's because there's something about the structures that imply there's like a predetermined a priori structure that controls, which really goes to the actual Leibnizian thing where God is ensuring that the best of all possible worlds is being expressed or something like that.
So on page 203, the paragraph preceding the one that introduces the four problems, they talk about Fernand Deligny and his studies of autistic children. The paragraph starts, as Deligny says, it should be borne in mind that these lines mean nothing. Now, you have to reread that line, because it's not that they are meaningless, it's that they don't mean in the sense in which they don't signify. So these lines mean nothing. That's the emphasis on mean, not on nothing. It is an affair of cartography. They compose us as they compose our map. They transform themselves and may even cross over into one another. Rhizome. There it is. It is certain that they have nothing to do with language. It's on the contrary language that must follow them. It is writing that must take sustenance from them between its own lines. It is certain that they have nothing to do with the signifier, the determination of a subject by the signifier. Instead, the signifier arises at the most rigidified level of one of the lines, subject to spawn at the lowest level. And here we go. This is what I was getting to. It is certain that they have nothing to do with a structure, which is never occupied by anything more than points and positions by arborescences, and which always forms a closed system precisely in order to prevent escape. The linear invokes a common body with a capital B, upon which these lines are inscribed as so many segments, thresholds, or quanta, territorialities, deterritorializations, or reterritorializations. The lines are inscribed on a body without organs, upon which everything is drawn and flees, which is itself an abstract line, with neither imaginary figures nor symbolic functions, the real of the BWO. And this gets us back to what I read earlier. The body is the only practical object of schizoanalysis. What is your body without organs? What are your lines? What map are you in the process of making or rearranging? What abstract line will you draw, and at what price for yourself and for others? What is your line of flight? What is your BWO merged with that line? Are you cracking up? Are you going to crack up? Are you deterritorializing? Which lines are you severing? And which are you extending or resuming? Schizoanalysis does not pertain to elements or aggregates, nor to subjects, relations, or structures. It pertains only to lineaments running through groups as well as individuals. Basically, schizoanalysis, the analysis of desires, immediately practical and political, whether it's a question of an individual, group, or society, for politics precedes being. Practice does not come after the emplacement of the terms and their relations, but actively participates in the drawing of the lines. It confronts the same dangers and the same variations as the emplacement does. Schizoanalysis is like the art of the new, or rather, there is no problem of application. The lines it brings out could equally be the lines of a life, a work of literature or art, or a society, depending on which system of coordinates is chosen. So the art of the new, the thing that I really wanted to emphasize with your question was when Deleuze asks, when he writes in 1967, published in 68, or was it published in 70? I got to remember. I got to look back. When he writes in 67, the essay, How Do We Recognize Structuralism? And still in Logic of Sense, he is working through these ideas of structures. It's with Guattari that he's able to take on, quote unquote, a post-structuralist point of view. And we looked at machine and structure. It's an essay that is very fruitful, and we could go back and look at again. But already the Guattari was pointing outside of structure, particularly due to his influence by Lacan and the structuralism of the symbolic, for example. So I think that's why.
So it was drafted in 67, but published in 72.
Okay, yeah. 72, yeah. So it's interesting that he sat on it, or that however it was delayed, it didn't come out until the year of Anti-Oedipus, right? So he'd written this kind of overview of structuralism and looking at it in different disciplines and finding out the elements it has in common, because for him it's not a homogeneous movement. It's a kind of strategy or theoretical tendency in these different disciplines. And it's interesting that he published it in the year in which there is already this break with structuralism to a certain extent. So yeah, that was interesting to me about your question of structure. So yeah, it's not about structures, signifiers, subjects. It's about lines.
Which lines imply they imply a dynamism and a motion and a movement and a change and a processual change over the static, over the kind of really like the overbearing Leibnizian determinism of yada yada, which is interesting how he mobilizes Leibniz against the self.
Well, or what's interesting is too, this recalls our discussion of Marx's dissertation and our discussion of Marx in Motion with Thomas Nail, where Marx is already realizing that the Kleineman is that there's already a dynamism to Epicurus's and Lucretius's theory of the Kleineman, that the atoms falling are already aligned. They're not mere points, if you will. So there's already a kind of sublation of the atom into the line, and that's where Marx is dialectically dynamic.
The Kleineman itself is kind of a line of flight, gesturing towards that, because it's already imminent to the other. I forget what the other components are, and it's already right. It's already there. It's already from the beginning. It's already present, and then it expresses itself in motion as we move along the lines of whatever type of I don't know.
No, yeah, I get. I'm picking up what you're putting down. So the last problem of the four. So the four again particular character of each line, respective importance of the lines, mutual imminence of the lines. And then the last problem is the dangers specific to each line. Now, they've already hinted at some of the dangers, but they say there's not much to say about the danger confronting the first, for the chances are slim that its rigidification will fail. There's not so much to say about the ambiguity of the second, but why is the line of flight, even aside from the danger it runs of reverting to one of the other two lines, imbued with such singular despair in spite of its message of joy, as if at the very moment things are coming to a resolution, its undertaking were threatened by something reaching down to its core, by a death, a demolition. And I think that is why they end with saying, nothing will enter memory. Everything was on the lines, between the lines, in the and that made one and the other imperceptible without disjunction or conjunction, but only a line of flight forever in the process of being drawn toward a new acceptance, the opposite of renunciation or resignation. And then they end with the question, a new happiness? This again, like in a certain way, this is why I brought up logic of sense earlier. In a certain way, there's a way in which some of these elements, although completely reworked and different, do remind me of Deleuze's discussion of the event and the ideal event, the sort of pure event that has just happened or is just about to happen, but is never currently happening. And his ethics, which is not to be unworthy of what happens to us, right? Not to be unworthy of our lines, right? Not to renounce or resign ourselves. And I guess the last thing I will say, and then I'll let you have the last word if you like. I read the start of this paragraph. It's the very last paragraph, but they quote, or Deleuze and Guattari quote Fitzgerald, perhaps 50% of our friends and relations will tell you in good faith that it was my drinking that drove Zelda mad, and the other half would assure you that it was her madness that drove me to drink. Neither of these judgments means much of anything. These two groups of friends and relations would be unanimous in saying that each of us would have been much better off without the other. The irony is that we have never been more in love with each other in all of our lives. She loves the alcohol on my lips. I cherished her most extravagant hallucinations. In the end, nothing really had much importance. We destroyed ourselves, but in all honesty, I never thought we destroyed each other. And Deleuze and Guattari say, beautiful text. Again, another one of the, especially in this plateau, they've done a lot of these like one word or two word sentences.
I really like the prose in this plateau seemed, I don't know, I liked it a lot better than a lot of, not that there weren't well-written stuff before, but I don't know, this one's kind of stood out. Maybe it's just recency bias, but I think
is it a coincidence? Is it a coincidence that their writing on literature might strike you better than some of the other stuff? So
I don't know, because I feel, even though I do have an English degree, I feel like I'm pretty much a Philistine as far as actual legitimate lit crit is concerned, and literature in general.
I got you, and I do think that so much of what they're telling us would be, I don't want to say anathema, but would perhaps not be what you would be taught in an English degree. When they rail against constantly over and over again, it's not about what this, that, or the other, specifically a text means. It's not about interpretation. That would seem to be anathema to the kind of core tenets of literary criticism, right? Where you're taught to find new ways of interpreting and quote unquote reading what is being, what the text means. And so I think that's the interesting thing about Deleuze and Guattari, who are going to ask the question about sort of how it works, right? The machinic aspect and how it runs together, to use how the lines of writing compose with these other lines, these lifelines, I think they named a number of them at the very top of the plateau. I got to go look. Not just lifelines, but obviously lines of flight. Let me see if I can find it. So they say not only is there a specificity of the novella, but there's also a specific way in which the novella treats a universal matter. For we are made of lines. We are not only referring to lines of writing. Lines of writing conjugate with other lines, lifelines, lines of luck or misfortune, lines productive of the variation of the line of writing itself, lines that are between the lines of writing. We would like to demonstrate that the novella is defined by living lines, flesh lines, about which it brings a special revelation. Marcel Arland is correct to say that the novella is, quote, nothing but pure lines right down to the nuances, and nothing but the pure and conscious power of the word. Yeah, it's just interesting to see them. And it's not surprising that they would devote a plateau to literature when we consider the first volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia and the way that Anti-Oedipus begins in the very first chapter with them running through a whole series of writers and authors and how they make clear that, it's like psychoanalysis is not a take it or leave it game. Their critique is not to say to reject it. It's to get it to function machinically as a cog with these other machines. The analytic machine needs to function together with the revolutionary machine, with an art machine. And we could obviously add philosophy and science along with it, considering their last work together, What is Philosophy? And all with the song of life, the machine of life, if you will, the lifelines. So I'm glad you enjoyed this plateau. And as I said, it feels transitional because we're going to take up this question of segmentarity and the four problems. And in the next plateau, micropolitics and segmentarity, we're going to go deeper into this question of the lines.
I'm glad that you brought up events because I really like this phrase, the novella is a laboratory of the event, and then clarifying how the event isn't like a thing, but is a redistribution of lines, be they molecular, molar, lines of flight, etc.
Have I told you about, I think it's in Dialogues, where Deleuze actually gives a note to the translators about the use of his word hexaity, which comes from Duns Scotus. And he says, so hexaity comes from the Latin haec, H-A-E-C, meaning this thing, or this very thing right in front of me. It's an indexical, right? But he says that sometimes it is written in French, especially as exceity, E-C-C-E-I-T-Y, which is like here, ecce. Ecce homo is behold the man, but another use of ecce is like here. And Deleuze says this sort of this mistaken etymology is actually fruitful because it gives us a way of thinking about hexaity as not indicating a particular thing or a body or an object, but as something like an event, right? 5:00 in the afternoon is an example that Deleuze gives, right? Or an intensity, right? Which would not be a standard thing, quote unquote, in our, if you will, our molar categories that are looking at subjects and objects and stuff like this. So yes, I think that even though they don't use the word hexaity here, I think it's, or wait, do they not? Well, wait, they don't say the word hexaity, but they do say on 203, they talk about the line of flight as already being complex since it has singularities. I do think the singularity and hexaity in Deleuze and Guattari speak, if not the same thing, they're performing very similar things. And Simondon himself seems to use them fairly interchangeably in his own writing, but I think he writes hexaity with the misspelling, E-C-C-E-I-T-E in French. He obviously talks about singularities, like in The Crystal, he talks about hexaities, even though he prefers the term singularity, I think. So hexaity is a good word to describe events without reifying it into a thing. So,
which is, I'm thinking about a couple of interesting just biographical things to close this out. One is, I think it's interesting that the Das biography of Deleuze and Guattari is called Intersecting Lives. Feels like a pun on the intersecting lines. And so there's that. And then in the Anti-Oedipus, is it Anti-Oedipus Papers?
Maybe. What are you thinking?
I'm just thinking about the Guattari describes Lacan as an event in his life.
There you go. Yeah, so that's good.
That's neither here nor there, but just some corollary little interesting historical notes. Maybe we might characterize it as. But if you don't have anything else, I think we can call that a wrap.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. Been another. Thank you for joining us on another episode of the Machining Unconscious Happy Hour. We'll see y'all next week.